So to start us off, I want to make sure we're all speaking the same language around social emotional learning, development, and mental health. So Castle defines social emotional learning. It's a process through which children and adults understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. That's a lot for anyone. Now, think about it and reflect on this for our individuals with autism. So Castle articulates 5 core competencies, and they say that social emotional learning enhances an individual's capacity to integrate skills, attitudes, and behaviors, and to deal effectively and ethically with daily tasks and challenges. The 5 core competencies can be taught in many ways and across many settings and environments. So think about this and reflect on what we set out to do with least restrictive environments for our individuals with autism. These skills can be taught, and they can be taught in lesser restrictive environments across settings. If you wanted to access the core competencies, the website is there. They go into great detail about, they really bullet point each of the areas to give you information on those skills that you would want to teach your individuals. So understanding social emotional and how it speaks to mental health conditions, mental illness. A mental health condition isn't the result of one event, just one event. Research suggests multiple overlapping causes. Genetics, environment, and lifestyle influence whether someone develops a mental health condition. A stressful job or home life makes some people more susceptible, as do traumatic life events. Some individuals who experience trauma, like being a victim of a crime. Biochemical processes and circuits and basic brain structure may also play a role. So as we reflect on this, think of an example of an individual with autism and manifesting variable behaviors, school-age individual, experiencing homelessness. Add to that, being hit by a car. Add to that, not achieving in school. Attendance is splintered, but not yet a chronic non-attendee that they would be noticed by the system. What do we do? How do we help? So that's when we start looking and examining at mental health conditions and mental illnesses and the interventions for these co-occurring conditions. NAMI describes or defines mental illness as a condition that affects a person's thinking, feeling, or mood. Such conditions may affect someone's ability to relate to others and function each day. Each person will have different experiences, even people with the same diagnosis. So we see that in autism, do we not? We see, once you see one case of autism, you've seen one case of autism. So reflect on that as you think about your individuals with autism that you're serving. Now, taking a look at this, this is the mental health intervention spectrum presented at 1994 Institute of Medicine report. And if you look at it, it really parallels and aligns with everything we do across our agencies, across our departments. The continuum of care looks at the environment. So if we look at the promotion, I would argue that the promotion spans the entire spectrum because you're always trying to promote the wellness in the system. These are strategies to create environments and conditions that support healthy resilience. When you move into the prevention, universal, selective, and indicated are all of those supports on the instructional level that we attempt to employ just in very lesser restrictive environments. Move into the treatment phase. That's when you're looking at specific services and treatment for diagnosed conditions. And recovery is the goal. We want to be able to support individuals to lead productive lives in the community. So treatment and intervention comes once they're diagnosed. We have many individuals with autism that have co-occurring conditions, and we are the specialists for the individuals with autism when we have the opportunity to work with agencies and collaborators in supporting these individuals with the co-occurring conditions. So what are the opportunities in the state that we have to be able to do this? So SB 82 is the Investment in Mental Health Wellness Act. And it originated out of the state's recognition that we have a crisis and we need to address the crisis. So the grant was called a triage grant, and the intention was to create opportunities for mental health workers to provide this crisis support. After input from the communities, they saw that the monies were going to adults and our children weren't being served through this grant. So they adapted and adjusted to SB 833, which they recognized and opened up to school-based triage. They had 17 applicants and 9 grantees for these grants. The state then recognized we need more because there's more interest than we have opportunities for. And now we have MHSSA, which is coming online. That's SB 75. For those of you who have not seen this information, please look it up. It is a wonderful, wonderful money opportunity for our school districts. If you are interested, it's mhsoac.ca.gov. It's the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission. Their goals are in prevention, timely access for underserved populations, early signs outreach for parents and community partners, primary care physicians, stigma reduction, discrimination reduction, and prevention of negative outcomes. So there's fiscal opportunities there for all of us. What does this mean for us? As captain, we are the leaders in this domain. We have been working for years in interagency collaboration. We are skilled in this. This is an opportunity for us now to understand how to help the whole child. Interagency cooperation gets us there. We want to address intensive level needs for specific supports that should be based in data from surveillance and or evaluation. Whatever you have built into your system for this surveillance, make sure you have the corresponding interventions. That is where we can help because we are knowledgeable in those EBPs where other professionals may not be. We can all partner with other agencies, departments, and personnel to support individuals as those specialists with specialists in EBPs. Specifically today, we are so fortunate to have cutting-edge examples of research and findings of mental health evidence-based practices and interventions that can be considered for this.
So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the basic diagnoses that we tend to see in our children with autism spectrum disorder. So I think if you've worked with any children on the spectrum, you know that a lot of children are affected by what we refer to as these kind of comorbid conditions. So some of the research studies suggest that upward of 70% of individuals with autism will have a comorbid disorder at any particular time in their life. And so some of the most common ones that we find in autism spectrum disorder are attention dysregulation kind of problems, so ADHD, conduct or oppositional defiant disorder, or just general behavioral problems, anxiety, mood disorder kind of problems, things like depression. And then occasionally, or more occasionally, we see what are known as more psychotic disorders. And so what I'd like to do today is take you through kind of some description of each of these kinds of problems, not so that you can diagnose and treat these kinds of kids in your classrooms, but just it might give you an idea of where to go to get help with some of your students. So first of all, attentional issues tend to occur in maybe 20 to 30% of individuals. conduct and challenging behaviors, and approximately a quarter. Anxiety, maybe 40%. And there's a lot of, you can see there's a lot of wide ranges, and I'm hedging my bets when I say these things because all the studies are very different depending on how you measure symptoms. Depression in maybe 30% of people, although by the time you get to adulthood, 77 will have reported that they've experienced depression at one time in their life. Psychotic disorders can range anywhere from maybe 8 to 18%. And sometimes we have trouble diagnosing these kinds of problems because of something that's referred to in the field as diagnostic overshadowing. So if in a person with autism you see what may be construed as anxiety disorder symptoms, if the person didn't have an autism diagnosis, you don't even bother to diagnose the anxiety because you think it's part of the autism. So it's complex. People with autism have been thought to have even potentially more of these kinds of problems than people with just general developmental disabilities. So here's a chart from a survey of all people with developmental disabilities showing that people with autism may have more anxiety and also other mental health kinds of challenges than even other individuals with developmental disabilities. And here's a chart that gives you a little insight into when these disorders first or have their big peaks in onset. So for ADHD, you can see that the ADHD symptoms start becoming apparent earlier on. According to old DSM criteria, you could diagnose them by about 6. So you can see that we tend to be able to think that people have ADHD relatively early. Anxiety disorders and mood kinds of problems like depression tend to have their onset a little bit later, more as kids are rolling into adolescence. And mood disorders, you can see, tend to persist really through the lifespan and reoccur or occur for the first time at later points in the lifespan. Schizophrenia is a disorder that tends to onset in late teen years. It's a little later for girls that may end up showing these symptoms. And substance abuse, again, also is a little bit on the later side. And any mental illnesses are also happening in adolescence. So now let's go through and let me just give you sort of a cover the waterfront and describe some of the symptoms of these disorders. So you can take this presentation, hopefully they're giving it to you to put in your desk, and if you're having any questions in the middle of a class and you're thinking about a student, you might want to pull this out. So ADHD kinds of issues. ADHD diagnoses are made on basis of 2 kinds of clusters of symptoms. One are hyperactivity symptoms. So those are things like the child who fidgets, squirms, can't stop leaving their seat. They're on the go as if they're driven by a motor. They blurt out answers. They have difficulty waiting their turn. They kind of get in the space of other people. And then there's inattention symptoms. Those are things like just being careless, not paying attention to detail, having poor follow-through when you give them an assignment, or bad listening skills. They lose things, they get distracted and are forgetful. To make an ADHD diagnosis, you can either have one or both types of those symptoms, and people say that inattention is more common in individuals with autism spectrum disorders. Symptoms are present before age 12 and have to be clearly impairing. So, note that a kid who is kind of age appropriate and how fidgety they are because they're young, that really wouldn't be, somebody who rises to the diagnostic criteria. One thing that we know is that children with intellectual disability, these things can be a little bit harder or trickier or look a little different to diagnose. So in those kids, hyperactivity tends to be more common, perhaps because they don't have some of the words to show the other symptoms. And with higher IQ individuals, that's more when you get the inattention symptoms. Another finding from our literature is that if you have ADHD symptoms, it tends to make functioning in other areas worse. So autism symptoms coupled with ADHD symptoms, people generally tend to show a little worse functioning than ASD symptoms alone. The next symptom group I'll talk about is conduct disorder, ODD, and problem behaviors. So diagnostic criteria: angry or irritable mood, argumentative or defiant behavior, maybe a little vindictiveness. Sometimes these symptoms just occur at home, but they can be present across multiple settings, and they can be very disruptive to the child's functioning and also to your classroom. ODD tends to be oppositional defiant disorder, that is, tends to be more common in those with verbal skills who can argue more with you and have higher levels of intellectual functioning so they can think up good arguments, and in boys, perhaps due to socialization. And one thing, I studied problem behaviors a while ago, and I realized that one thing that was very important to consider is that sometimes our children with autism appear to be very in your face or very oppositional, when in reality, if you stop to think of their autism-related challenges, they may not really effortfully trying to be defiant and in your face. They just may not understand what's going on around you. So it's really important before you jump to this red button like, he is just so hard because he's being defiant, that you really, or she, that you just stop and you really try to think through how their autism symptoms may be playing into this. The next area of symptoms that you will often see is anxiety. Anxiety is excessive fear or worry, and recently studying anxiety myself, I learned that there's many different ways to be anxious. We have social anxiety, which is really a fear of being laughed at or ridiculed by other people. Specific phobia, which is a fear of a specific thing. Heights, spiders. Generalized anxiety disorder, which is more like over excessive worry. And separation anxiety disorder. And that is, kids who are really can't leave their parents or caregivers. Now, this diagnostic overshadowing is really a big problem here because it can be very hard to differentiate anxiety and autism symptoms, so much so that one of our colleagues has kind of made a new instrument that kind of tries to tease apart some of these. So children with autism, because they may not have really good theory of mind or ability to understand perspective, may actually not meet full-blown criteria for social anxiety because they don't really fear being ridiculed. That hasn't even occurred to them. They're just, they have they just don't like people potentially, or just don't really like social interaction. I don't think that they don't like people, but they don't really enjoy social interaction, or they're afraid of something else, that it's loud, So sometimes our kids with autism don't quite meet the criteria. They also have fears of change, and this is a big one. It's hard to know, are they just really anxious because they're afraid of the change, or do they have an insistence on sameness because they're a person with autism? Symptoms of depression, so you probably know depression is defined as feelings of sadness, hopelessness, worthlessness, lack of motivation, and you lose your ability to concentrate, and may not necessarily have a trigger. In children, including children with autism, they may not look sad. They may instead look irritable. So if you see a child who's having a real baseline change from how they normally are and they're all of a sudden quite irritable, you might want to think about other things going on in their life. Suicidality has become a big issue, spoken about by National Institutes of Mental Health, and people are realizing it's something we do have to be on the lookout for, even with our kids with autism. Depression is more common in girls in the general population, and maybe more so in girls with autism. Sometimes a symptom of depression in people with autism is just spending more time in their circumscribed interests. That can also be a sign of anxiety. And it may be more common in those with higher IQs and higher social awareness, but that is still something we need to study better. Finally, there's psychosis, and in my own work, I've worked a lot with people who study psychosis, and I think psychosis in people with autism occurs less frequently. What I've observed is that populations that have psychosis often have a lot of sort of PDD-like characteristics. But to diagnose psychosis, a person has to have positive symptoms. So positive symptoms are things like hallucinations, auditory and visual. Actually, auditory hallucinations are more common than visual hallucinations. They have to have delusions, confused thought or speech, or odd mannerisms. Delusions are things like thinking everyone's out to get you or that the TV's really talking to you. And negative symptoms, so they have what's called anhedonia, which is a lack of pleasure. They may have a flattening of affect, and here you can see that some people with autism appear to be a little flat too, so it's a little bit of a differential diagnostic challenge at times. They may withdraw and struggle with life skills, same with people with autism. There's a real history of lumping and splitting in autism and schizophrenia, kind of along the lines I was mentioning. I don't believe that most people with autism go on to develop psychosis more than people in the general population, but you do see a lot of people with psychosis who have PDD-like traits. As I mentioned before, it tends to onset in late teen years. So if you do have a kid with autism who's all of a sudden acting a little more bizarre in late years, that might be something to think about. And there's also something called the prodrome, which is kids that are starting to fall into this psychotic kind of thinking. So those are kids who, all of a sudden are beginning to seem a little bit more bizarre or in their own world. They may have a family history, and that is important time to catch kids because that's a time when you can really help and intervene early before you get more of a downward spiraling. And we have really good programs at UC Davis to help with that. If you ever have any issues with that, I can put you in touch with those people. So just to wrap up now, again, you don't have to do this, you want to get referral, but what kinds of things can we do to help these kids? Because we really can help these kids. So for ADHD, we have medications, we have parent training programs. There are even attention training programs on computers that can be helpful. For behavior problems, again, we have some certain classes of medications that can be helpful. Again, parent training can be really helpful. I've personally done a trial of a therapy called parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT, which was really helpful, as I mentioned. Anxiety, again, we have medications. We also have a lot of cognitive behavior therapies that are being designed for people with anxiety, and mindfulness, meditation kind of based therapies, and the STAR trial. So they mentioned Karin was kind enough to mention when I came up here that I'm working on a trial currently. We have a wonderful free trial at the Mind Institute. Our great study coordinator, Karin, is sitting outside, and I hope you will stop by and pick up a flyer. This is a service where children can receive either CBT or medication. They get randomized to one condition or a pill placebo. If they're put into the placebo condition, which we need because it's a clinical trial, we need to be empirically rigorous, they do receive their choice of treatment after that phase. So it's really, I think, a wonderful opportunity for families. So if you have any kids you think have anxiety with autism, we want to know about it and we want to help you. Depression, again, medications and CBT, and mindfulness-based approaches, and psychosis, again, a lot of the same thing. And like kids with autism, we also believe that since going into young adulthood, we can help with vocational training.
I want to talk about empathy, first of all. As Karin was saying earlier, this is part of this social emotional learning, and we have always said for the longest time that autistic people lack empathy, that we lack theory of mind, that we lack the ability to understand the perspectives of other people, or even lack caring. And as far as perspective taking goes, there's some truth to this. I acknowledge that. But it's also the case that neurotypical people struggle to understand the autistic point of view. This is what we call the double empathy problem. And you can see how this becomes a serious issue when we come to all of these co-occurring diagnoses that Dr. Solomon was just talking about, because that requires understanding what's going on in the autistic person's own mind. Now, this is something that I myself have experienced. For one thing, I am pretty sure that I used to have anxiety, but I never got a diagnosis. So clearly that was overlooked if that actually was the case. Also, I used to have very, very severe sensory sensitivities that made it very difficult for me to function back in a middle school environment. And unfortunately, I don't think that some of my teachers believed me about this. I think that they thought that it was some kind of strategy that I was using to cheat the system and get out of doing things that I didn't want to do. And I acknowledge that, yes, sensory sensitivities in autism are extremely complex. I don't have time to unpack it all, but they're affected by state of mood, how tired somebody is, how much control they have over the sensory stimuli, and they are related to anxiety itself. If I know that a distressing sensory stimulus is about to happen, I'm going to be anxious about it. I'm going to be vigilantly scanning my environment looking for the distressing sensory stimulus, which of course is going to make the experience that much worse, which in turn is going to make my anxiety worse next time, which is going to make the distress worse, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the many ways that mental health in autism can be, in fact, heavily related to the environment around autistic people. That's not always the case. There may be things about autism that are inherently leading to some kind of mental health problems. Like, for example, I believe that autistic people often have either a very intense direction of focus or at least some difficulty shifting attention from one thing to another. This hasn't really been studied, but I think it's entirely plausible that that could lead to some difficulties with rumination. Unstudied, but quite possible. As Dr. Solomon was saying, we have this intolerance of uncertainty, which is a feature of autism, as well as potentially this anxiety, fear of change, this need for some control over the environment, or at least some difficulty when the environment suddenly changes and becomes unpredictable. But here already, this is the environment creeping in, even though it's a feature of autism. And same for sensory sensitivities, as I said. Social isolation and bullying, of course, that is going to affect mental health. How could it not? Same for feelings of inferiority. If people are looking around and seeing other people are having more success, having an easier time of doing things, that too is going to affect mental health. And then we come to this idea that there is something wrong with autistic people, that autism is this deficit, this disorder. This is an idea that is actually has a great deal of potential to damage people's mental health, and it's very pervasive in our society. It's this idea that being normal is right. And this is, just a handful. I could list many more, some not related even to autism itself. Like, for example, a lot of autistic people are LGBTQIA. There's a lot of gender diversity, diversity of sexual orientations in autism. That, too, could lead to some social rejection, some discrimination, and that's definitely something that schools need to be vigilant for if that is, in fact, happening. So, long list of things that are in the environment that could affect mental health. And I think one way that this happens is autistic burnout. This is something that a lot of autistic adults talk about. It's something that really resonates with a lot of our experiences, but it's something that I don't think is penetrated yet so much into clinical practice, into research. I thought I would introduce you to it, unless you already know, which would be great. But I don't think most people do, unfortunately. This is the idea that it's exhausting to constantly have to meet demands in our environments. For example, we're in environments that were built by and for neurotypical people without regard for autistic sensory sensitivities. And then if we're having these distressing sensory experiences, it's going to take energy for us to deal with that. Trying to appear more neurotypical, to mask or camouflage autism. This is something that is a rather new idea. For the longest time, it has been the explicit goal of many autism interventions to make autistic people appear more neurotypical. That has been our goal. But now, with this camouflaging idea, we're realizing that what we're asking people to do is to hide who they are, constantly, to constantly pretend to be somebody other than who they are. This is not easy. This affects identity. It takes an incredible amount of energy to keep it up. So if you're pouring all of your energy into this, then you're going to lose energy for other things. That could lead to loss of skills and to mental health problems. This is something that I myself have some experience with again. Back when I was in middle school, at the beginning of the school year, I'd have a fair bit of energy, relatively speaking, but then, as I would go to school, I'd come back home completely exhausted, which is, I think, very common. And then as the year would go on, my grades would go down, my sensory sensitivities would get worse, my anxiety would get worse, and ultimately, I'd be having psychosomatic illnesses because my body was desperately trying to get some respite from this environment that it knew was just not working. I needed a break. Now, I do want to have a quick clarification here, because you will hear the idea that this is caused by excessive expectations, expecting too much of autistic people. I think we actually have a problem with low expectations. I think that far too often we have this situation where we're showing through our behavior that we don't expect autistic people to succeed. This is what happens when, the paraprofessional comes in and does something for the autistic individual. They are sending the message that they don't expect the autistic person to be able to do it for themselves. And then, the autistic person will internalize that idea. They're not expecting to succeed, and if you're not expecting to succeed, why would you make any effort to try? So these low expectations, they become a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. So the problem isn't that we have high expectations. The problem is that we have silly expectations. The problem is that we're expecting autistic people to do everything the same way that a neurotypical person would. Why would we expect that? Though they're not neurotypical, we're not neurotypical, so we're going to do things a different way. We have to have high expectations, but the right kind of high expectations. So, what do we do about this? Well, this is all in the environment, and the nice thing about that is it means that it's something that we can, in fact, change. So the first thing that I think comes up is flexibility. This is kind of like the double empathy problem that I mentioned earlier. Yes, autistic people can be inflexible and rigid. I acknowledge this. There is some truth to this. But I reply that neurotypical people can also be inflexible and rigid at times. Okay. Yeah, thank you for acknowledging this. So we have to be more flexible. We have to be creative. If something is not working for an autistic individual, then we have to change that. We have to be open to that if there is, in fact, a change that can be made. Often, if you look at autistic people's autobiographies, you see, oh yes, there was this one teacher, and this one teacher was flexible and got me and changed things and was great, and that really changed my life. So wouldn't it be so much better if all of the teachers in your schools were like that one teacher? Wouldn't it be so much better if all of them were? I have high expectations of you, clearly. But if I had low expectations, then, that doesn't work, as we've seen. Right. Autistic pride. This is another thing that I think is super important. All too often, autistic people in the schools are viewing their autism as a source of shame, something that they should be ashamed of. They're not aware maybe of this idea of neurodiversity, or they don't accept it, that this diversity of minds and brains is a good thing. They're not in touch with the wider community of autistic people. They don't have autistic role models or mentors. And I think a lot of us just take it for granted that we'll have some kind of role model we can look up to and identify with, but that might not be available. So I think that schools could do a lot about this. Schools could be looking in their communities to see if there are autistic people who could be good role models, or at least maybe some public figures or historical figures, people like, Greta Thunberg or Isaac Newton or somebody like that. There's a lot of things that could be done to fix this issue. Also, evidence-based practices are all very well and great, but we have to deliver them in a way that is respectful of the autistic person, and I think we have to be very careful as we're doing this that we're not suggesting that there's something wrong with autistic people. I certainly hope that we're not using words like disorder or deficit to an autistic person's face, but it's still very easy to subtly send this message that the autistic person needs to change, that there's something wrong with them. Now, this is complex. I know this is complex because, of course, people do need to grow and develop and change. It's a great thing about being human to have this ability to grow and develop and change. But I submit to you evidence that you will have seen in your schools that neurotypical people as well grow and develop and change. We can all agree that neurotypical people do this, yes? Great. So, funny thing, neurotypical people, we're not telling them that there's anything wrong with who they are, and yet they still grow and develop and change. So why do we think that telling this to autistic people will be helpful? Also, as I said before, normalization shouldn't be a goal in and of itself. If an intervention will help autistic people's quality of life, great, but we shouldn't be trying to make people neurotypical for no other reason than appearing neurotypical. Now, one quick, you can applaud. Okay. Right, thank you. I always appreciate applause. All right, so I thought I'd give you an example of a program that did this really well, which was a theater program that I used to be in. That is me as Captain Hook. And this was a program that was not a therapy program. That was made very explicit that this was not a therapy program. Now, funnily enough, it happened to have therapeutic benefits. It's probably a major part of the reason that I'm up here now talking to you and not some anxious mess hiding off in the corner like I would have 10 years ago. Also, it was a great form of social practice. So it had therapeutic benefit, but it was not a therapy program, which made it a more comfortable environment. Also, it was an inclusive program. It had both autistic and neurotypical people, but there was never an idea that the neurotypical people were there as models. There was never this idea that we see so often that the neurotypical people are so much better than the autistic people, that they're there for the autistic people to slavishly copy just because of that superiority. And that, of course, is a very demeaning and uncomfortable idea. So we don't need to have these ideas. In whatever intervention program we have, I'm not saying that everybody should go off and do theater. I'm saying that in whatever programs are being done in the schools, these are things that we can do in them. Ultimately, though, we do have to reach this fit between the individual and their environment. And I said before, I have high expectations of you, and I hope that we can find this environment in the school context where the autistic person already is. But if we don't, then that could lead to this problem of autistic burnout and all these mental health problems, and then somebody is entering adulthood and they're miserable and they don't have the energy to go off and succeed in that environment, in that they don't have what they need to go through the adult transition. So and it is the case, I realize, despite my high expectations, that sometimes this is very difficult because, in a classroom you have dozens of students with very different needs, and how do you accommodate all of those needs in the same space? It's very difficult. Which brings me to the question of school placement. Now, right now, to a certain extent, we have a system that is set up in order to get rid of students who are perceived to be difficult for the running of the system. Students with intellectual disabilities or so-called behavior problems of some kind or another might be sent off to some specialized setting where they are out of the way and not interfering with the running of the system. And that can be inherently restrictive, and that term restrictive I understand to be about overriding the individual's rights and preferences, and if you're overriding the individual's preference to be in a mainstream setting and sending them off somewhere else, if you're overriding the family's preference, that is restrictive. But on the other hand, it's also the case that you might have somebody who's having some mental health problems, some burnout in the mainstream school, but suffering in a silent way that is not interfering very much with the running of the system. This is where I was when I was in middle school. And the system is not set up to get rid of these people because they're not interfering with the running of the system. Now, in my own case, I was able to get out. I was able to start being homeschooled, and that was so much better. It really did turn my life around in many ways. And it emphasizes to me the importance of finding the right fit between the individual and the environment. And so if we have people who are in a mainstream setting who don't want to be there, then that is inherently restrictive as well, because we're again overriding the rights and preferences of the individual and their family and insisting that they be somewhere that they don't want to be. Which brings me to my somewhat idiosyncratic take on all of this, which is that everybody should have a right to be in the mainstream schools if that is where they want to be. But I do not understand a right to be the same thing as a duty or an obligation. If people would rather be somewhere else, then I think we need to think about what kind of other environments could exist for these individuals. Because again, there are other things that we can do, but if somebody is in an environment that is inherently the wrong kind of environment for them, then mental health problems to a certain extent are just going to follow as a consequence of that. So we need to make sure that people are in the right environments.
I am going to talk today about my work developing and testing a mental health intervention for publicly funded mental health services. So I'll start by just saying that we know that children with autism are served actually in many different public service systems. And there may be more that are not reflected on this slide, but I want to emphasize the role of mental health services. And what I mean by publicly funded mental health services are those that are typically referring to traditional outpatient mental health services that may be Medicaid funded, in community mental health centers, community-based agencies, or directly operated clinics that are operated by county behavioral health departments. Schools are also a place where mental health services are provided, so they may be delivered by counselors within schools or districts contracting with other agencies to provide educationally related mental health services. So I'm really talking mostly about outpatient and school-based psychotherapy and counseling services. So I just want us all on the same page of kind of the services that I'm talking about today. Mental health services, as we've talked about, the other speakers have really nicely described today, are really important because co-occurring mental health conditions are very common. And so we want to ensure that we're meeting the needs of children and students who have autism plus potentially other co-occurring conditions. So in a previous study, we've seen different data on the prevalence of mental health disorders generally in the population. Well, these data are actually based on children who are receiving mental health services, right? So they should have higher rates of mental health disorders because they are being treated for mental health services. So these data are children who are ages 5 to 13. This is in Southern California, so it was San Diego and LA counties, both in outpatient and school-based services. And we found that almost all of them met criteria for at least one non-autism psychiatric disorder. Probably what's most important here is that almost 80% of them actually met criteria for 2 or more additional diagnoses. And the average age here is about 8, so they're 5 to 13, but relatively on the younger side. Most frequently what we saw was ADHD. But then in this age range, we also saw that a number of children, about half of them met criteria for ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, and anxiety disorder. We see lower rates of depression, and I think that's based on age of these kids. If we had an older age range, we were looking at children who are in outpatient mental health services, the rates of depression would likely be higher. So the bottom line here is that we know that the children who are being served in outpatient and school-based mental health services have really a complicated diagnostic profile. What is common across these children is that what is getting them to services is challenging behavior. So kind of regardless of what their diagnostic patterns are, challenging behaviors are, broadly, are what's really prompting parents or teachers to refer them to services. And so my research came out of a need that was identified by mental health providers. They were saying, please help us. We don't get training in autism, but we're seeing more and more children who have autism, and we want to effectively serve them, but we don't get training. We don't get training with this population. Is this sounding familiar? Has anybody heard this before? Okay, and so we had really mental health providers, so frontline providers were saying this, program leaders were saying this, county mental health department leaders were saying this. And so really that's what launched my area of research, was looking at, well, what are the needs of these children and the therapists and counselors who serve them. So when I started in this work over a decade ago, I initially thought, well, we could take an evidence-based practice and just train mental health providers in it. But at that time, there wasn't really a name brand practice that was designed to fit within psychotherapy or counseling settings. So there was lots of evidence-based practices. You know these practices, right? That individual strategies, comprehensive practices, but they really weren't packaged for psychotherapy and counseling. So that's what we went about doing, is how can we want to build something that's scalable and that's feasible and fits within the service system. And so our approach to doing this was really about, okay, first we need to assess what are the needs of the providers and what are the needs of the children and their families, and then use that, and then respond to those needs by packaging these evidence-based strategies for delivery in mental health. Then try it out, see how it works, assess, refine in this kind of iterative, really community-partnered approach. So we have lots and lots and lots of versions of the Aim High manual because we keep getting feedback and it keeps getting better. So really the way that this research started is we started with a needs assessment, then we pilot tested, we started with a needs assessment, then we met with our community providers and their leaders to take what the needs assessment showed and then what the evidence-based strategies were and to put them in a usable package. Then we pilot tested it, got a whole bunch of feedback, revised. Then we kind of took it to scale and are now on our second large-scale trial of Aim High. So what is Aim High? So Aim High is a package of evidence-based, both parent-mediated and child-focused strategies that are really aimed to reduce challenging behaviors in children who are 5 to 13 and have autism, but most importantly that they're receiving some psychotherapy. It's intended to be delivered in psychotherapy or counseling settings. So we do take a function-based approach to understanding challenging behaviors and their associated psychiatric conditions to really inform the skill-building focus of the intervention. We know that all of the individual components of Aim High are well-established evidence-based strategies, and now we have data from large-scale effectiveness trial that shows when we train therapists to use Aim High, that their kids show greater reductions in challenging behaviors than when the children receive usual care. I do always like to emphasize that we developed this in collaboration with mental health providers and families and autism experts based on that needs assessment. We did design it to be delivered by folks who are not autism experts. And because most of the mental health providers that, if you go into a mental health clinic, are not autism experts. There's a few, but most are not. So that was really who our target is. So the way that the Aim High is structured is that it's really all in service to identifying skills and actively teaching them. So we start with really the focus on teaching parents to systematically gather information about patterns and functions of behavior. Is this sounding like a functional behavioral assessment? Well, there's some similarities there, but really what we're working on is helping parents to see patterns in challenging behaviors, right? So it really has that purpose. And then based on multiple observations and interviews with parents, really identify what's the most common purpose and functions of challenging behaviors, and what psychiatric comorbidities could be contributing to that pattern of challenging behaviors. And then that's used to really identify child skills that are needed and complementary parent skills. So when Patrick was talking about that interaction between the environment and a child and an individual, this is where we're really focusing on the environment and individual interaction. So we always have two sets of skills. And then we use active teaching strategies to teach both parent and child skills. Even when we're working in the schools, we're working with parents, in case anybody had that question. And then we also get the question of, well, what do you do about the co-occurring psychiatric conditions? Most of these kids have multiple. Well, we address those symptoms within the context of addressing the behaviors. We in our needs assessment with therapists, they said, we really need help adapting psychotherapy because the way that what we normally do, it doesn't work. We have a hard time engaging kids who are on the autism spectrum and to teach them skills so they don't respond in the way that other children do. That's what we heard from therapists. And so in response to that, we really try to help them to adapt psychotherapy for this population. And what we emphasize of the way that to adapt psychotherapy is to kind of harness the power of autism and to really kind of come away from a deficit model to really thinking about, well, what are the characteristics of autism that we can harness to help us, to help the children and their families. So I'll give you some examples of that. The curriculum, Aim High is really a framework for helping understanding challenging behaviors and identifying skills. What we teach a child is really going to be different based on what their patterns of challenging behaviors are. So when Jeff was showing the really nice examples of the different skills that one might teach in CBT, we have therapists who are teaching those exact skills because that was what's needed for that child. So I just want to emphasize that there's not a set of skills that people will use. It really depends on their patterns of challenging behaviors. So the Aim High protocol is such that we start with really structured treatment planning. Now, I will tell you, the not so secret is that treatment planning is the beginning of intervention. When we did our needs assessment, therapists told us we need help setting goals and identifying skills, so that's why the treatment planning is such an important part of the protocol, but it really is starting with psychoeducation for parents. And then we spend a bulk of the time with active teaching, actively teaching parent and child skills. There's no set number of sessions for this. It really depends on, you probably need at least 13, 14 sessions to get through an Aim High protocol, but there's not really session by session guides. It really depends on the child and the family. So why do we, and then I'll just say that we have a number of within session elements. That's how we frame how you adapt psychotherapy. So why do we focus on challenging behaviors? There's many different challenging behaviors that children come in with. It could be noncompliance, it could be arguing, it could be verbal aggression, physical aggression, it could be active withdrawal, is also a challenging behavior. So there's a number of challenging behaviors that children come in with, and we know that in autism there's very high rates of challenging behaviors. They also can be the displayed symptoms of other psychiatric symptoms, such as anxiety, ADHD, and so forth, and can be the most impairing symptoms, and are really stressful for families and very stressful for teachers. And like I said previously, they could be the primary are likely the primary presenting problems in mental health services. And that's not actually autism specific. That's for kids. A lot of what we do is not autism specific. So when we start training therapists, we start with teaching therapists to view challenging behaviors through an autism lens. And so these are some of the challenging behaviors: noncompliance, aggression, tantrums, and so forth, that a child might come in with. And so we start with talking about what are the most common attributions that a parent or a therapist or a teacher may have about a child's behavior. The number one we hear is they're oppositional. Has anybody ever said that about a child with autism who is presenting with challenging behaviors? Right? We kind of sometimes use that. Or that there's poor parenting, that this is the parent's fault that the child is engaging in the challenging behavior, or that they have negative role models and that they're picking up bad habits and so forth. So we hear this kind of stuff a lot. And so when we train therapists, we really start with having them catch these attributions and thinking about challenging behaviors differently. Because if we have these attributions for a child's behavior, automatically for a child's behavior, it's somewhat unhelpful from a treatment standpoint, from a treatment planning standpoint. It doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what to do. So we really work with therapists on having this and applying an autism lens. And I think Patrick talked about this a lot already today, is that what could be underlying challenging behaviors may be kind of patterns of social communication interactions, the restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors or interests. Kind of, we talked about the inflexibility, fixed interests, the sensory sensitivity. That could be underlying challenging behaviors. We often will have therapists say, well, the parents and the teacher says that behavior comes out of the blue. Well, behaviors don't necessarily come out of the blue. We just can't identify always the trigger. And so that is often can be related to sensory issues. There's the co-occurring mental health disorders and kind of a motivation profile that really we see high rates of learned helplessness in this population where there's overdependence on adults and so forth, all of that can contribute to challenging behaviors. And so we really try to encourage therapists to take a step back and look at what might be underneath these behaviors as opposed to they're just oppositional. So as far as kind of our aim-high framework, when we start with our behavior tracking, therapists are working with parents to start to look at how often and what the patterns of challenging behaviors are. Actually, just tracking behaviors can be helpful for parents because they start to see the patterns, and then when you can see patterns, it becomes a little bit less stressful because you can start to predict when behaviors occur. But we always consider how autism and other psychiatric symptoms can contribute to those challenging behaviors. So if a child also has anxiety, we often see that the function or we don't say function, usually we say purpose of the challenging behavior is to avoid, right? So that is very common. With children who have more kind of ADHD symptoms, often it may be for the purpose of attention, right? So not always, but that's just often what we see. And then once we identify what the patterns are, then we can look at the skills. So our child skills, we really move away from that ABA term of replacement behaviors, because if a child is anxious and they're avoiding something, we don't just want to replace their challenging behavior with a better way to avoid something, right? That is not indicated in treatment for anxiety, regardless of autism or not. So we want to think about more coping and tolerance skills, but I think Jeff really was kind of sharing some of those examples, and emotion regulation skills. So sometimes we talk about short-term skills. So in the short term, to bring behaviors down, we might encourage a child to ask for a break, but that is not the end point. We don't want kids just repeatedly asking to get out of something. That doesn't necessarily help their functioning. So we are really talking about broader calming skills, coping, self-regulation. For parents, we're working on the environmental modifications that you all know very, very well. A lot of what we teach parents, it comes from education and good teaching. So, but we teach them prevention strategies, kind of those antecedent. We don't use the word antecedent anymore, but they're antecedent-based strategies to prevent challenging behaviors. And skill promotion strategies, which is like prompting, reminders, priming. This is all education stuff that came from you guys, right? and then how parents can respond to challenging behaviors. And then we really spend most of the time focused on in-session skill building using active teaching. So when we talk to therapists about adapting psychotherapy and counseling, I use both terms interchangeably because in schools often it's counseling and outside of schools psychotherapy. So we first teach therapists about how to structure their sessions for both engagement and skill building. And so this stuff is not going to be surprising to you, but we often talk about having a session schedule that's visual and posted. And so really what our aim high session schedules look like is that we review with the parent or the child, whoever is there, what they did between sessions. And then we teach parent and or child skills using active teaching. And then we summarize the session and plan for between session or home practice. And then we always end with something motivating because we want therapy to be fun and engaging. So we always end with kind of choice time, however the therapist wants to frame that. We also talk about maximizing structure and predictability through warnings. We emphasize using visual aids. Again, you all know this, right? You all know this came from education, but is not necessarily what we see in kind of usual care psychotherapy or counseling that may not be structured in the same way that we would a classroom. And the other thing, actually, that I will mention is that we really do try to, like we see, if you can see on the screen, it's kind of small, but you guys know Minecraft Steve, right? So we do talk about using preferred interest. Minecraft Steve and Minecraft tends to be a preferred interest, or it has in the past. And so we do often talk about how to harness the power of special interests, not to get rid of them, right? But harness the power and the motivation of special interests. And that if a child is really into Minecraft, if we're teaching about emotions, that using some visual that includes their special interest is a way to help with attention and engagement, and it's just more fun. And this also works with kids without autism. That's for everything we teach. It all works with kids without autism as well. But that's just one example of the harnessing kind of special interests. So as far as engaging parents and children, like I said, we really try to incorporate their special interests, topics, and then share control of materials with the child. So for example, we had for one child, their special interest was the Fresno State Bulldogs, and which is great. And so the therapist, what they did is they wanted to incorporate the child's special interests, and then also give them control over the session. So she posted a session schedule, and then kind of printed out the Fresno State Bulldog, and as they went through the whole session, child got to move the picture of the Fresno State Bulldog down the schedule. This is simple, right? This is not rocket science here, but it's very powerful, and so we encourage therapists to really think creatively. If this child is interested in Fresno State, or they're interested in Minecraft, let's think creatively about how to incorporate that into sessions. I do want to talk a little bit about how we teach skills, because the focus on Aim High is all about identifying skills and then teaching them. And so we use this active teaching sequence. So in first kind of labeling the skill that they're teaching, so labeling the skill, not talking about the skill for too long, right? Getting kind of quickly into practice before that, modeling the skill for the child. What do you want them to do? What do you want them to say? And this goes for parents too. We have the same active teaching sequence for parents. Evidence-based learning strategy is the same for everybody. And you saw in Jeff's example, the therapist does model for him what he can say, what the child can say, and then provide an opportunity to practice in session. That is what we tell therapists they should be spending the bulk of their time doing, is practicing in session and practicing lots of different ways, because generalization is challenging. And then we provide immediate feedback and specific feedback. Often we have to include rewards. When we're teaching kids, we often recruit rewards. So we heard that there was stickers. I think in the example with Candyland, there was some kind of token economy, stickers or some kind of chart like that. We often have to use that initially, not forever, right? We're not going to use stickers forever to have a child engage in a new skill. It's just to kind of motivate them initially, and so it becomes more natural, until it becomes more natural. When we're working with parents, we don't usually emphasize rewards with parents, but it is very, very important to be providing parents with specific feedback. And then we always make a plan for practice at the end of a session. So we really emphasize this whole sequence for both parents and adults. This is not autism specific, really, in any way, but it's really important. So as far as what we're finding with Aim High is that we're successful in training people who are not autism experts. So this are social workers, MFTs, psychologists, psychiatrists, school psychologists. We've kind of trained lots of different disciplines, and we're really successful. A vast majority of therapists are successful in learning Aim High. And that was really important because we wanted to make sure it could be delivered by folks who aren't autism experts. The therapists view Aim High as useful and effective for children with and without ASD. We actually often get emails after our initial training of, oh, I tried, the Aim High session schedule with my child with ADHD who doesn't have autism. It works for them too. And that what we see is that parents are more engaged in sessions. And actually, we see a very significant increase in parent involvement in school-based counseling services. The other thing is that we see, we have lots of videos, thousands of videos of therapy, and that when we score therapists for evidence-based strategy use, such as modeling, behavioral rehearsal, all of that, we see that therapists are using many more of them when they're trained in Aim High than in usual care. And that therapists are creative in individualizing what does Aim High look like for this child versus another child, which is what we want. And then lastly, probably what's most important is that when we train therapists in Aim High, the children's challenging behaviors, we see greater reductions over 18 months, actually, even though they may only be services for 6, we really see improvements in challenging behaviors compared to usual care. So you might be asking, well, how do you learn Aim High? The process of learning Aim High is it takes 6 months. So we don't just do a workshop and then expect people to do that. Most evidence-based practices don't do that. But we do this kind of introductory workshop, which I kind of conceptualize as priming. And then the real learning happens when therapists are delivering Aim High to their actual child, not a practice case, they're somebody on their caseload, while they're going through a structured consultation series. So we have 12 consultations that are didactic, but then also provide opportunities for performance feedback. And we have our trainers review videos and provide performance feedback based on fidelity monitoring. So we are right now in the last year of recruiting for an implementation trial that we've actually just gone statewide with. We are at the very end of recruitment, but if your school district is offering mental health services, counseling services, and you think that it can be anywhere in California, you think that they would benefit from AIM High training, please tell us right away, like within the next 1 to 2 weeks, because we want to be able to assess whether you're eligible. But we start to get limited by the school year, right? And so we can't get too far into the school year to start training. So if you think that there's therapists and counselors in your district who'd be interested in receiving this training, we're happy to talk to you about the fit. So with that, I just want to acknowledge in this research, we refer to them as participant partners, and those are parents, therapists, program leaders, system leaders, our community partners. There's lots of co-investigators, our team's research staff, including many who are actually here at UC Davis, and our funding, which is the National Institute of Mental Health.
I want to emphasize, we aren't asking all of you to be the clinicians, the experts in providing counseling CBT. What we have the skill and the ability to do is to bring them into our fold. Give them those skills in EBPs that were just demonstrated on our guest speakers' slides to be able to have them incorporate those interventions, those things that work for our kids into their sessions, okay? So we have the expertise in autism. We can give them the psychoeducation on autism. They have the expertise on CBT, and we can work together to understand which EBPs to incorporate into their sessions, okay? Just be very clear about that. Collaboration is key. We know and we understand that ASD is complex, okay? It's critical to work collaboratively with others involved in the treatment and education of individuals with the ASD. Again, as a captain cadre, we have the knowledge to help providers understand the individual who is in that session with them. Captain cadre can partner to share which EBPs might make mental health treatment more effective for an individual with ASD. I'm going to say it again and again. Captain cadre can collaborate to design modifications so the treatment is better suited to the learning styles of an individual with ASD. Okay, so for example, repetition, visuals, concretes, models, all those wonderful EBPs that we know about.
I think we have decided we're going to go in the order in which we talked, which we spoke. So I'll take a first few questions here that I received about anxiety and autism primarily. So one person asked about specific phobias, and they said, are the phobias typically things that most people have? Spiders, heights, change, or odd things like birds, objects, imaginary things? Actually, interestingly, in autism, we find both. We find people that have the heights and the spiders, but we also find people that have interesting phobias like black toilets, the Columbia Pictures woman logo, and so we actually do find both. In that instrument I was telling you that talked about different autism diagnosis and trying to tease apart anxiety and autism symptoms, these are called atypical phobias. So yes, we see both. Okay, Patrick, you want to go?
Sure. So the question that I have here is about autistic bloggers and social media from autistic people that's very critical of ABA. If you go online, you will find people who loathe the idea of ABA, who find it traumatizing to even think about ABA. There is a lot of opposition towards ABA within the autism world, and the question is, what do I think about this and about directing parents towards ABA? This is a very complex question. Before I go further, I want to say that I have never undergone ABA myself, nor do I research it, so that kind of limits my ability to to answer it. But that being said, I think first thing, ABA is a very broad term. There's lots of different kinds of ABA, like Lauren was talking about some of the more functional stuff that might be particularly relevant in the school age years, and that's a technique that has a lot of potential to have some positive effect if it's used well to sort of overcome the double empathy problem, figure out what sorts of things out in the environment are related to behaviors that are hopefully indicators of distress to the autistic person, and then to change those things. That, I think, is inherently positive. But there is a danger with ABA sort of practices that I think a lot of autistic people worry about, where the target could be something else, that it could be chosen poorly. And maybe you're trying to change something about autism itself, or rejecting the person, like trying to eliminate a stimming behavior that is self-regulatory, so people worry about that. I think also people worry about, the early intensive behavior interventions that those could do the same thing, focusing on changing autism into something else, that the privatized nature of a lot of our ABA providers might put pressure on them to talk about autism in negative ways, to advertise their services. I could go on and on. There are many critiques. I think that naturalistic developmental practices as far as early interventions go, and trying to teach language and things like that, this is inherently useful. And I know autistic people who have undergone ABA who will agree with me on that they are glad now that they have language. But I do think that it's an important issue, and if you have time, you might want to look at some of these critiques and think about how that might apply to the populations that you work with. That's a complex question. Also, I wrote about this on my blog, and one of my other questions was about whether I have like a social media or internet presence. I think it's in your handout somewhere that I have a blog called autisticscholar.com, and I talk a bit more about that issue there. Does anybody else want to add anything to that? Because it's kind of a complicated question. Okay. All right. I'm glad that we're all in agreement. That's always nice.
Just as far as, I want to answer another question, but just as far as the ABA, I just really want to reiterate what was already said. I mean, if we think of applied behavior analysis as that umbrella of the use of operant conditioning principles, that you see that in CBT, you see it in a number of different evidence-based practice models, and it somewhat gets conflated with ABA services. And so that's an important distinction. But transitioning to services, there was a number excuse me, of questions about thoughts or suggestions about increasing access to mental health services for people with ASD, as they are often refused. We absolutely have seen that pattern. In California, across the state, is that a parent calls a community agency, an outpatient clinic, and says, my child has autism, they need therapy. That often is the non-starter right there. I'm seeing nodding here, right? So, I would encourage us to think of what the purpose of mental health services are, and they are to treat the mental health condition, not the autism. And so, and in fact, in California, for Medicaid or Medi-Cal services, autistic disorder is an excluded primary diagnosis for mental health services. And so that's where I think that there's some challenges, and that actually gets overgeneralized. So if a family was to call the same agency and says, my child has difficulty with anxiety, they may not be shut down at the door, even if they said, oh, and they also have autism. I think that it's about encouraging the families when they're seeking mental health services to focus on those other symptoms. And that, of course, schools come into play here too when social emotional goals and services are included in their IEP, that educationally related mental health services can be an important way for children to access mental health services.
Okay.
Back to you.
Should we go to a round two? Sure. Okay, so round two. Okay, I got several questions about kind of around the idea that it seems that we're discussing mental health specific services to support individuals who have higher intellectual ability levels and higher levels of language. And what about more impacted individuals? I will just say that one thing I neglected to say is that in our STAR trial, the cognitive behavior therapy intervention we're using is Jeff's Biaka model. And one of the things we really wanted to do in this trial was address that concern. And Jeff and his colleagues down at UCLA have conducted a trial or two now using an adaptation of his Biaka model for children who have IQs as low as about 50? About 50 now. So in our STAR trial, we are accepting children with IQs as low as 50. We take the materials in the Biaka curriculum and we make them more pictorial as opposed to verbal. So we teach a lot of the same basic principles, but we try to use graphics instead of a lot of language. So we are doing our best to try to help in that regard. In the STAR trial, we're looking for children ages 8 to 14.
Thank you. So I got what I find to be a very interesting question because I sort of geek out over these things. Somebody noticed that I was saying the word autistic and not person with autism, which is person first language, which I think most clinicians and educators and researchers tend to use person first language. But from autistic adults, lately we've been seeing a critique of that that's saying, well, you know, you're trying to dissociate the person from their autism, which reveals that you have an inherently negative view of autism. Like, we say things like a person with cancer, but we don't say things like a person with femaleness or something like that. So this sort of thing reveals some attitudes, and I don't want to get hung up over person identity first language, and of course there's complexities. If somebody is autistic, or a person with autism I should say, and actually prefers person first language, then you want to respect that. But I think that it's often useful to, you know, think, would I use this term to talk about a typically developing person? Like, for example, I could say that somebody has autistic development or they have typical development, and I'm using the same terms. But if I'm using some different terms, then that might be a problem. And, you know, we don't want to send the message through our language that there is something wrong with people. Or often, you know, if you do this, you might find that something about the language that you're using reveals an attitude that you have that maybe perhaps should be changed. Also, the comment speaks to, you know, things like goals for eye contact, and I think that's, you know, very similar to what I was just saying about stimming, or what I was saying earlier about, you know, normalization and making people more neurotypical. That, you know, if somebody's finding eye contact stressful, they might actually prefer not to work on increasing eye contact, because that might take energy that they could instead use to learn to navigate a social interaction better. And if they're constantly focusing on staring at your eyes, for one thing, some people end up creepily staring at you constantly, which is not useful. And secondly, then that's taking away energy that they could be using to navigate that social interaction.
I got some questions about delivering AIM High in schools. So one of them was about how do you engage parents in school-based mental health services, and that is often more challenging than outpatient, and partially just because of expectations. And so, I mean, very pragmatically, there's the point in this question about the schools are not necessarily, or parents aren't necessarily around during the school day. And so we really work with the therapists to be creative. So actually, one of the first AIM High videos that we had and that we coded was a school-based therapist. She's in an empty classroom with a child, and there is a phone on the table with their mom had called in from her lunch hour and was participating in that way. So they had both the child and the parent there. That's great. And there are some school districts that have access to iPads and have used, you know, FaceTime or whatever kind of video conferencing with parents if the parents aren't able to come in. And then I think that some districts have been flexible with schedules as well. And so I think that it's really just on a case-by-case basis how how therapists working in schools have navigated that parent engagement process. Sometimes at the beginning of Aim High, it's actually not essential to have the child there. Because you're actually working with the parent on understanding patterns of challenging behaviors, and it's not always great for kids to hear their parents talking about their challenging behaviors. And so that actually frees up the scheduling a little bit if the initial sessions are with parent only. And they can happen over the phone as well, and that's fine. So we don't have really like inflexible ways of how parent engagement needs to look.